I want to do something a little bit different here at the first part of the program. This is thanks to my good friend, Brother Dave, the correspondent who lives in the desert. I don't know how he does it, but he's a regular listener. Come on, Mike. He has heard me talking, as you have many times, about institutional racism or systemic racism or systematic racism. The condition that so many white fascists, Christian fascists in this country want to deny exists, and to deny any discussion about it, even though it does exist, of course it does. Now, it does exist in kind of another world for most white people, because we don't feel the systemic racism that our black and brown brothers and sisters have felt ever since before the beginning of this country. It is there. Now, I understand that a lot of people who listen to this podcast fully get it, what systemic racism is. It's built into the system. It's there. It has always been there. And in order to rip it up by the roots is going to be difficult. Some say it's going to be even impossible, but we have to try, do we not? I think we do. I believe we do. So thanks to Brother Dave, who sent this to me. I want to share it with you. I'm going to read it directly from Britannica. It's not that long, but I want you to tune into this, okay? Here we go. Institutional racism, which is the perpetuation of discrimination on the basis of so-called race by political, economic, or legal institutions and systems. According to critical race theory, an offshoot of the critical legal studies movement, institutional racism reinforces inequalities between groups. In other words, in wealth and income, education, healthcare, civil rights, that is enforced on the basis of the group's perceived racial differences. Institutional racism became a particular focus of scholarly investigation in the 1980s, especially in the United States. Since the late 20th century, the notion of biological race has been recognized as a cultural invention that is entirely without scientific basis. Nevertheless, racism categorizes people by skin color, ethnicity, and culture to distribute societal goods and resources in a fashion that unfairly disadvantages members of some groups and, without merit, benefits others. The concept of institutional racism is predicated on the supposition that racism is not always conscious, intentional, explicit, or obvious, but instead is frequently ingrained in systems, laws, policies, beliefs, and practices that result in, condone, and perpetuate inequitable treatment and oppression of people of color, especially Black Americans. Although many scholars use the terms institutional racism, systemic racism, structural racism synonymously, other scholars distinguish between them, noting that the emphasis on systemic racism is on the systems involved, as, for example, legal systems, political, educational, and criminal justice systems, whereas the emphasis on structural racism is on the elements that provide the foundation for those systems, including policies, laws, and institutional practices. Institutional racism, on the other hand, has been used as an overarching term that encompasses the roles played by both systems and structures in discrimination and oppression based on so-called race. Arguably, institutional racism has been prevalent in American society since colonial times, beginning with its overt expression in the institution of slavery, black codes, and Jim Crow segregation. As early as the turn of the 20th century, sociologist and activist W.B. Du Bois described racial discrimination as being institutionalized within multiple sectors of society and also as being self-perpetuating. In contrast to the nakedly discriminatory policies and practices of the Jim Crow era, the aspects of contemporary systems and structures that have created social, political, and economic inequities and injustices for Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, and Asian Americans are increasingly hidden, ingrained in the standard operating procedures of institutions and eschewing racial terminology. Many whites are unaware of them. Institutional racism is often identified through examples that are used as proof of its existence. On average, Black Americans are less likely than similarly qualified white Americans to be hired for jobs or to receive loans. Disenfranchisement through voter suppression and disempowerment through gerrymandering are prime examples of political marginalization that are said to result from institutional racism. Unsubstantiated or exaggerated allegations of voter fraud have led to changes in voter identification requirements and reduced accessibility to polling places that, voting rights activists argue, have disadvantaged Black Americans. Residential segregation, explicitly codified in the Jim Crow era, but reduced after the Fair Housing Act of 1968 outlawed racial discrimination in housing, that residential segregation has persisted in the United States, in no small measure because of discriminatory public and private lending policies and practices that have discouraged loans for individuals living in so-called redlined neighborhoods, designated as hazardous. While post-World War II federal loan programs dramatically increased home ownership for whites, people of color were frequently denied opportunities to buy homes, thus restricting access to the principal method of accruing generational wealth. Many Blacks and Hispanics continue to live in racially segregated and impoverished neighborhoods, partly as a result of zoning restrictions that effectively exclude lower-income residents from living in many predominantly white neighborhoods. Predominantly Black or Hispanic neighborhoods also tend to receive fewer or inferior public services. Notably limited access to good public schools further limits opportunities to obtain good jobs and benefits or to pursue higher education, thereby limiting upward mobility. Blacks are more likely than whites to be unjustly suspected of criminal behavior, not only by white private citizens, but also by police officers. Moreover, separate and unequal neighborhood conditions contribute to abusive policing practices, and blacks are more likely than whites to be victims of police brutality, including the unjustified use of lethal force. There's also a pervasive pattern of discriminatory sentencing practices. If convicted of a crime, people of color are generally incarcerated more often and receive longer sentences than whites who are found guilty of the same offense. Now, I'm going to stop there. But what I just shared with you from Britannica is arguably the heart of so-called critical race theory. There it is. Did you hear anything in what I just shared with you via Britannica, anything that you could sit there as a white person and say, no, that's bullshit? I don't think you could. I know I couldn't. When I first read this, when Brother Dave first sent it to me, I read through it and thought, okay, let me see what's true and what's not true here, or what's true and what is exaggerated here. And there was nothing. It's all true, every single bit of it. And this is how we have become, we whites, so ensnared by racism. And we don't even goddamn realize it. I remember back in the late 70s here in Atlanta, when I first started hearing about redlining I didn't know what the hell, redlining, what is that? What is that? And there was an investigative piece written in one of the alternative newspapers here that I saw that showed a map of Atlanta and actually had the red lines drawn around those areas that the white lending institutions, which were all of them at the time here in Atlanta, would not lend money to prospective homeowners to buy a house there if that prospective homeowner was a black person. And when I first saw that, all of a sudden it was like in the cartoon, where a light bulb goes off over one of the cartoon characters' heads and the character gets an insight all of a sudden. I get it. That's what happened to me. Here in Atlanta, the city, the heart, the beating heart of the civil rights movement. And when I first saw those maps and realized what the hell was going on here, because it never occurred to me. No, it didn't. Even in the 70s, I claim my ignorance. I do. But it never occurred to me that such a thing was occurring. That lending institutions, insurance companies, and banks refused to finance house purchases, home purchases by black folk. And that statement that owning a home, owning some property is one of the primary instruments of intergenerational wealth is so true. It's so true. But the main reason I wanted to share that with you, again, I would assume that most people who listen to this podcast are not unfamiliar with the idea of racism in all its many presentations, and God knows, they're all over the place, even today, even with the awareness that such a thing as systemic racism exists. Even with that awareness, so much of what goes on does not affect white people. And when white people see black folk in the streets holding up signs that say no justice, no peace, a lot of black folk or a lot of white folk think, what the hell do they want? Look at all the black entertainers, look at all the black athletes, look at all the, and then things kind of peter out right at that point. What? Wait, And then when the Black Lives Matter movement showed up in this country, because primarily of George Floyd, all of a sudden, we whites started seeing signs, Black Lives Matter. What? Black Lives Matter. Okay. Who said they didn't? Not realizing that the very system says they didn't. They didn't matter as much as white lives by any definition. So, okay. What do we do about it? What do we do about it? The truth is, it takes legislation. When you stop and think of the civil rights legislation in all its many forms that has been passed since the Lyndon Johnson era, or maybe the John Kennedy era, where actual civil rights were addressed in legislation, trying to say to citizens of this country, look, goddammit, this has got to stop. This bigotry against black folk has got to stop. Whether it was Voting Rights Act or Education Act or Healthcare Acts, whatever they were. But it didn't stop, did it? Huh? We had the laws on the books. But if a black person feels that they have just been discriminated against, what does that person do? That person usually cannot afford to hire a lawyer to sue, file a civil action against a discriminatory organization or business or bank or whatever. So what does a black person do? What can she do? Not much. So it's February. And this is a month when we're supposed to discover that white folk exist. I mean black folk. Not people who show up for the Grammys, not people who show up for the Academy Awards, not superstars on the football gridiron or the basketball court. No. I'm talking about just, black folk like me, like you. Just working class stiffs who are trying to make it, trying to get through this life and make it on to the next, if there is one. So the month of February is when we are supposed to acknowledge that, we whites. Oh, it's February again. Oh, George Washington Carver. Martin Luther King Jr. I do slip into cynicism. I apologize. On this particular topic especially. Because cynicism is not going to get me anywhere as a white person. It's not going to get the rest of the white folks in this country anywhere being a cynic. What we have to be is open. Try to understand. Try to focus on, what our black brothers and sisters deal with every day and whether or not there's anything we can do to alleviate that pain and anxiety and stress and tension and fear and uncertainty that is day-to-day stuff for black folk. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. The Progressive Voices Network brings you commercial-free commentary from today's leading progressive radio hosts and pundits, like me, Mike Malloy, 24 hours a day. I'm not your typical old guy from the 80s or the 90s talk radio host, and Progressive Voices is not your typical talk radio network. It's a listener-supported nonprofit with no corporate control whatsoever over our broadcast. So hosts like me, Mike Malloy, are free to rant and scream and carry on about whatever we like. We're often controversial, but we're never boring. Weeknights, 9 p.m. in the East, 6 p.m. in the West on the Progressive Voices Network. Always progressive, always on. I'm Mike Malloy. Keep it lit.